Imagine standing in a room, right? You're surrounded by the most powerful, highly educated leaders of your nation.
Right, the absolute elite of the society.
Exactly. And you haven't committed a crime. In fact, you've been helping the poor. But as you look at the faces of these judges, you know with absolute certainty that before the sun goes down, these men are going to drag you out into the street and crush you to death with heavy rocks.
Oh, it's a terrifying scenario.
It is. And the craziest part, they're going to do it believing they're serving God.
Yeah, that perfectly captures the psychology of absolute power when it feels threatened. It's incredibly dangerous.
Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we are analyzing a massive collision between a lone individual and an entrenched power structure. We're looking at a really fascinating historical and textual account from the book of Acts, specifically chapters 6 and 7.
And, just to be clear up front, we are just reporting on the content provided in these ancient texts. We're not taking theological sides or endorsing viewpoints, but just trying to convey the ideas exactly as the original source material presents them.
Right, exactly. And whether you have a background in ancient texts or not, you are going to want to hear this, because this isn't just like a religious story. It is a masterclass in high-stakes debate, the vulnerability of institutions, and the incredibly dangerous consequences of challenging the status quo.
We are dissecting a moment where ancient history perfectly mirrors the modern dynamics of power, smear campaigns, and just total institutional panic.
Okay, let's unpack this. The protagonist in our source material is a man named Stephen. The text describes him as full of grace, power, and the Holy Spirit, performing wonders among the people. But, more importantly for this story, he is a devastatingly effective debater.
Oh, absolutely.
He's arguing with a specific group of people, and he is just publicly dismantling their worldview. So they decide he has to go.
Yeah, to understand the friction here, we really have to look at the cultural landscape of Jerusalem at the time. Stephen is what the text calls a Hellenistic Jew.
Okay, so what did that actually mean for him?
Well, in first century Jerusalem, you had traditional Judean Jews who spoke Aramaic and leaned heavily into very local customs. But you also had Hellenistic Jews, Jews who had lived in the broader Greco-Roman world, spoke Greek, and had absorbed different cultural influences. Stephen was one of the latter.
So he's viewed as a bit of an outsider by the traditional establishment, like he belongs to the religion, but he doesn't totally fit the hometown mold.
Exactly. He's the opposite of a hometown favorite. And the people he is debating are from the synagogue of the freedmen. These are also Jews with roots outside of Judea, places in North Africa like Cyrene and Alexandria, and provinces in Asia Minor.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, many of them were likely former slaves or descendants of slaves who had earned their freedom and moved back to Jerusalem. They are deeply zealous about their Jewish identity because, frankly, they've had to fight for it in the diaspora.
Wait, so Stephen and these freedmen are essentially peers. I mean, they're both Greek-speaking Jews from the broader empire. This isn't some complete outsider attacking the religion. This is a really intense, inside baseball theological debate.
That is the core of the conflict. It's an internal, intellectual civil war. And the text is incredibly blunt about the outcome. The leading men of the synagogue simply cannot hold their ground against Stephen's wisdom. He is just running circles around them.
Which brings us to a pretty universal truth about human nature. When someone completely outclasses you in a public argument and your pride is on the line, you don't usually thank them for the new perspective.
No, you definitely don't.
You destroy them. You attack the person when you can't attack the premise.
Right. And the sources tell us that because they couldn't win the intellectual dissension, they pivot to external persecution. They secretly bribe false witnesses to spread a very specific rumor. They say Stephen is blaspheming Moses and blaspheming God.
They realize they can't beat him in a fair fight, so they incite a mob, they rile up the public, the elders, the legal experts, and they drag him before the Sanhedrin. Now, for you listening, the Sanhedrin isn't just a church board.
Not at all.
This is the supreme religious, political, and legal council of the day. They hold immense power, and the specific charges the witnesses bring forward are fascinating. They claim Stephen is saying that Jesus the Nazarene is going to destroy the holy place, the temple, and change the customs handed down by Moses.
Which is a brilliant piece of propaganda, to be honest. It takes something Stephen probably did say, that Jesus was bringing a new covenant that superseded the old temple system, and it twists it into a terroristic threat against the nation's most sacred institution.
I really want to look at the mechanism of that threat. In the original notes, I saw an analogy comparing this to a corporate whistleblower, but honestly, I don't think that captures the life or death gravity here.
How so?
Think about a medieval king who rules a desert kingdom because he controls the only oasis. He has an absolute monopoly on water. If some wandering teacher shows up and says, hey, the rain is about to fall freely for everyone, that teacher isn't just proposing a new water policy.
Right, he's destroying the king's power.
Exactly. He is directly threatening the king's entire reason to exist. The Sanhedrin controlled the temple. The temple was the only place to sacrifice, the only place to be cleansed, the epicenter of wealth and political leverage. Stephen is essentially saying, God is bypassing your oasis.
That is the perfect mechanism to keep in mind. If God doesn't need the temple, the Sanhedrin is out of a job. What's fascinating here is how the text contrasts the ugliness of this orchestrated smear campaign with Stephen's physical reaction in the courtroom.
Yeah, it's so striking.
The source notes that as this council of powerful, furious men glares at him, his face looks, quote, like the face of an angel.
Which feels like a very deliberate, pointed image for the author of Acts to include for this specific crowd.
Oh, it is a massive neon sign pointing straight to Moses. When Moses descended from Mount Sinai after encountering God and receiving the law, his face was literally shining with divine radiance.
Wow, so the irony there is thick.
Right. The profound irony of this scene is that the council has hauled Stephen in on charges of hating Moses. But by highlighting his shining angelic face, the narrative is telling the reader that Stephen is actually the one functioning like Moses. He is the one bringing the new, authentic divine revelation to a resistant people.
So Stephen is standing there, radiating this unnatural calm, accused of tearing down their most sacred institutions. Now, if I'm on trial for my life, my first instinct is to get a lawyer and fight the specific charges. I'm going to argue the facts of the case.
Naturally.
But Stephen doesn't do that. He doesn't cower, he doesn't play defense, and he certainly doesn't beg. Instead, he weaponizes their own ancestors against them. He launches into this sweeping historical epic.
He begins his defense by zooming all the way back to the patriarchs, Abraham and Joseph. He points out that the God of glory appeared to their forefather Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia.
Right.
And later, he notes that God was with Joseph when he was sold into slavery and taken down to Egypt.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Look at his rhetorical strategy. He's standing in front of the ultimate gatekeepers of Jerusalem men who believe that this city and this physical building are the center of the universe.
Yeah, it's everything to them.
By starting his story with Abraham and Joseph, he's proving his orthodoxy, sure. But he is subtly dropping these massive geographical breadcrumbs.
He is totally dismantling their theology of location. He's pointing out that the founding moments of their faith happened far outside the Promised Land. God moved in Mesopotamia. God rescued in Egypt. God is universally active.
He's basically saying, you guys have trapped God in a zip code, but our own history proves he doesn't need your building.
That's exactly it. And there's another chord running through this part of the speech. Why focus on Joseph? Joseph was a righteous man who was deeply misunderstood, envied, and ultimately sold out by his own brothers, the patriarchs of the Israelite tribes.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Yeah, Stephen is laying the groundwork for a brutal historic pattern. Israel consistently opposes and rejects the very men God chooses to save them.
Having established that God operates freely outside their borders, Stephen zeroes in on the exact historical timeline and the very man he is accused of blaspheming Moses.
Right. Stephen walks them through the history of the Israelites in Egypt. Now, the sources provide a very detailed timeline of the patriarchal movements. Jacob moves to Egypt in 1875 BC.
Okay, 1875.
And the enslavement begins 30 years later in 1845 BC. What matters for Stephen's argument is the weight of this enslavement. The texts highlight a 430-year sojourn, with 400 of those years being in strict bondage, eventually leading to the Exodus in 1446 BC.
I really want to pause on that because it's so easy to just read 400 years as a historical statistic and keep moving. But for you listening right now, try to conceptualize 4 centuries of multi-generational slavery.
It's almost unimaginable.
That is, grandparents, parents, children, all born into chains, living their entire lives in brutal subjugation and dying with nothing to show for it. The psychological pull, the sheer hopelessness of waiting for a promise made to Abraham that never seems to arrive. It's staggering.
It really is.
So how does that level of trauma play into their reaction when Moses finally shows up at age 40 to try and deliver them?
It creates an atmosphere of pure survival and deep suspicion. Stephen recounts the story. Moses, raised in Pharaoh's household, goes out to his people. He sees an Egyptian beating an Israelite, and Moses intervenes by striking the Egyptian down.
Right, he murders the guy.
Exactly. The next day, he tries to mediate a dispute between two Israelites, assuming they will recognize him as their protector. Instead, they reject him completely. They push him aside and say, "Who made you a ruler and judge over us?"
I have to be honest, I'm not totally sure I blame the Israelites there. If I'm an enslaved person and a guy from the palace comes down and secretly murders an overseer, my first thought isn't, oh, here's our great deliverer.
No, of course not.
My first thought is, this guy is going to bring the entire Egyptian military down on our heads. It seems incredibly reckless on Moses' part.
It was impulsive, and it backfired spectacularly. Moses assumed his brethren would understand that God was granting them deliverance through him, but they didn't understand. They were terrified of the immediate consequences.
So they push him away.
Yeah. So, rejected by his own people, Moses flees into exile in Midian and stays there for another 40 years before God finally speaks to him in the burning bush.
They looked at the man sent to save them and saw only a threat to their fragile status quo.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Stephen is drawing a profound, inescapable parallel here. Look at the mechanism of what happened. Moses offered himself as a deliverer. He was rejected by his brethren, who refused to recognize his divine appointment. He went away to a distant land, and then much later he returned with power as the ultimate deliverer sent by God. Stephen is arguing point blank that Jesus of Nazareth experienced this exact same pattern.
Wow, he's saying, you rejected Jesus just like our ancestors rejected Moses. The Sanhedrin feared Jesus' disruption of their power, just like the enslaved Israelites feared Moses' disruption of their survival.
Precisely. Stephen has just turned their accusation completely upside down. They accused him of blaspheming Moses. Stephen proves that they are the ones acting exactly like the people who originally rejected Moses.
The trap has been set, the jaws are closing, and now Stephen pivots to the most explosive topic of all, the Sanhedrin's idolization of the physical temple. This is the core of the charge against him.
Stephen reminds them of what happened in the wilderness after the Exodus. Even with Moses actively leading them, the moment Moses went up the mountain, the people demanded gods they could see and touch. They worshipped a golden calf.
Yeah, a classic story.
But Stephen brings up even darker history, quoting the prophets to say they took up the tabernacle of Moloch and the star of the god Rephan.
Okay, what exactly are those? Because that sounds incredibly ominous.
Moloch and Rephan were astral deities, basically pagan gods of the surrounding nations. Moloch in particular was associated with horrific sacrifices. Stephen's point is that the Israelites had a desperate psychological need to manufacture their own gods.
They wanted a god they could put in their pocket.
Exactly. They wanted deities they could carry around, deities they could control. They fell in love with the works of their own hands. And because of this persistent idolatry, God eventually allowed them to be conquered and deported into exile in Babylon.
He's drawing a straight line from the golden calf to the building they are sitting in. He's saying, you guys have a historical obsession with worshiping the things you build rather than the God who built you.
He continues the timeline. He acknowledges that they had the tabernacle in the wilderness, which David wanted to replace, and Solomon eventually built the physical temple. But the moment he mentions Solomon building the temple, Stephen drops the hammer.
Here it comes.
He immediately quotes the prophet Isaiah. Yet the Most High does not live in houses made by human hands. Heaven is my throne, and earth is the footstool for my feet. What kind of house will you build for me, says the Lord?
So what does this all mean? Connect the dots here for us. The Sanhedrin has turned the temple into a localized box for the creator of the universe. They became so obsessed with the bureaucracy, the rituals, and preserving their own elite status within those walls that they completely missed the actual mission.
They entirely lost the plot.
Right. God was moving on through Jesus, bringing a new covenant, but these leaders were too busy protecting their real estate to see it. It's like legacy infrastructure getting in the way of true innovation.
They had domesticated God, or at least they thought they had. And this brings us to the absolute climax of the trial. Up until this very sentence, Stephen has been incredibly strategic with his pronouns. He has repeatedly used inclusive language, our ancestors, our fathers.
He's been keeping them together.
Right, he has been standing shoulder to shoulder with them in their shared flawed history.
But then the tone shifts so violently it gives you whiplash.
He drops the R and switches exclusively to you and your fathers. He looks at the Supreme Council of his nation and calls them stiff-necked people with uncircumcised hearts and ears.
I want to break down that insult because to a modern listener, uncircumcised hearts might just sound like, I don't know, weird poetic phrasing.
Yeah.
But in that room, that is the ultimate nuclear religious slur, isn't it?
It is devastating. Physical circumcision was the absolute non-negotiable biological marker that you were part of God's chosen covenant. To be uncircumcised meant you were a pagan, an outsider, cut off from God.
Wow.
By telling the High Council, the most religiously observant men in the world, that their hearts and ears lack this marker, Stephen is essentially calling the leaders of Judaism spiritual pagans.
But I have to ask, isn't this just suicide by cop? I mean, Stephen's a brilliant guy. He knows exactly how much power these men hold. He knows they can have him killed. Why intentionally provoke them with such incredibly harsh, inescapable language?
Because it's no longer a legal defense, it is a prophetic indictment. He isn't trying to save his own life anymore. He is delivering a verdict on theirs. He says, which of the prophets did your ancestors not persecute?
He's just going all in.
Yeah, he points out that they received the law delivered by angels, but they couldn't even keep it. And then the ultimate accusation: your ancestors killed those who foretold the coming of the righteous one, and now you have become his betrayers and murderers. He puts the blood of Jesus directly on their hands.
When you back a powerful, prideful institution into a corner with unassailable logic, and you expose their deepest hypocrisies in front of everyone, the reaction is almost never self-reflection. It is almost always violence.
The reaction of the Sanhedrin is visceral. The text says they were cut to the quick, a phrase that basically means they were sawed in half emotionally. But instead of repenting, the elite, educated veneer completely shatters. They become furious and literally gnash their teeth at him. It's an image of feral, animalistic rage.
I want you listening to really visualize this scene. You have a courtroom filled with the wealthiest, most dignified, highly educated scholars in the city, and they are completely losing their minds. They are grinding their teeth like cornered predators.
It's pure chaos.
And juxtaposed against that chaos, you have Stephen. The text says he is full of the Holy Spirit. He looks up into heaven, and he sees a vision of the glory of God and Jesus standing at the right hand of God.
That specific detail, Jesus standing, is really crucial. In almost every other biblical vision of heaven, Jesus is described as seated at the right hand of God, signifying that his work is finished. But here, Stephen cries out, I see the heavens opened and the Son of Man standing. Why is he standing?
It's like a standing ovation. He is rising to welcome his first martyr.
Exactly. But the council cannot handle this claim. The idea that this man they are about to execute has a direct line of sight to the divine is just too much. The text says they cover their ears.
Wait, literally?
Literally. Grown men, the political and religious leaders of the nation, literally clapping their hands over their ears and screaming at the top of their lungs so they don't have to hear his words anymore.
It's the ultimate psychological regression. They rush him. They drag him out of the city limits because their own twisted legalism says you can't shed blood inside the whole city, and they begin to stone him. And let's be clear about what stoning is. This isn't throwing pebbles. This is a brutal, agonizing execution method where heavy rocks are hurled to crush the victim's chest and head.
This raises an important question about the blinding nature of institutional panic. The Sanhedrin thought they were silencing a threat. But the absolute irony is that by executing Stephen, the council perfectly validated the exact point he had just made.
Oh, man. They proved him right.
He told them, you always kill God's messengers, and their immediate response was to kill him. They proved his thesis with their own violence.
And as the rocks are breaking his body, Stephen falls to his knees. He doesn't curse them. He doesn't scream for vengeance. He cries out, Lord, do not hold this sin against them. He's being crushed to death, and his final breath is a plea for the forgiveness of the very men murdering him.
It is a staggering, unnatural level of grace. But the source material leaves us with one more incredibly significant detail right at the edge of the frame. As the witnesses are hurling these stones, they take off their outer cloaks to get better leverage.
Okay.
And they lay those cloaks at the feet of a young man who is standing there, actively approving of this brutal execution, a young man named Saul.
Which brings us to the core value of this entire deep dive for you today. We started by talking about monopolies, power structures, and the expectation of a fair trial. Stephen's final moments are a jarring warning about the profound danger of becoming so preoccupied with your own legacy, the way things have always been done, that you violently resist the truth when it threatens your control.
It's a trap any institution can fall into.
Right. The Sanhedrin had a monopoly on access to God, or so they thought, and they committed murder to protect their real estate. It's a terrifying look at what happens when our systems become more important than the reality they were built to serve.
It is a sobering reality, but I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, something that builds on the psychology of this text. We are told this young man, Saul, zealously approved of Stephen's execution. In fact, following this event, Saul initiates a massive campaign to hunt down and exterminate the rest of the disciples.
He becomes the ultimate persecutor.
He does, but put yourself in Saul's shoes for a second. He stood there holding the coats and watched a man's body be destroyed by rocks. Yet amidst that gruesome violence, he saw that man hold on to perfect, transcendent peace, and with his dying breath, ask the universe to forgive his murderers.
Yeah, you don't just walk away from seeing something like that unchanged.
Did witnessing that radical, completely impossible act of grace plant a psychological seed in Saul's mind? A cognitive dissonance that would quietly grow, eventually shattering his own rigid, legalistic worldview and transforming him into Paul, the very champion of the movement he was trying to destroy.
That is the power of a single moment of sacrificial grace in the face of absolute hatred. It breaks worldviews wide open. Sometimes the truth doesn't win through a pristine, logical courtroom argument. Sometimes it wins through an undeniable act of courage that changes the trajectory of history forever. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the trial of Stephen. We hope it gave you a new lens on history, the mechanics of power, and the profound courage it takes to speak the truth when the room turns against you. We'll catch you next time.